My family wants to give my house to my brother after kicking me out for not having space. But I'm not going to do it. I warn everyone here that this is going to be very long, so long that I'll divide it into 2 posts and include a summary for each. Honestly, I don't care who believes this. It's so crazy that I don't blame anyone for thinking it's fake. I won't argue about it, but this really happened to me. I also don't mind if anyone from my family sees this. I'm not going to sugarcoat anything, but I won't reveal details that include people who don't know me. I'm a single man in my 30s. I have a brother who is 29 and already has 4 kids. He had his first child at 22, then the second came a year later. The third, 2 years after that. And the fourth was just born a few months ago. His wife, my sister-in-law, and I don't get along because she always tries to act superior and then became a dramatic queen of extreme victimhood. If I defend myself in any way, she can cry in an instant and put on an extremely convincing act to get sympathy from almost anyone. My parents and my brother absolutely adore her, even though they know exactly what she's really like, and they just don't care. She's very attractive, I'll give her that, but she's so horrible that I could never feel attracted to her. She also refuses to get any kind of job despite having a college degree, and my mother voluntarily helps with the kids all day, so their finances depend completely on my brother. This also means they can't afford to live anywhere but my parents' house, and privacy is an issue with everyone under one roof in a 3-bedroom house built in the 1960s. Growing up, my younger brother was clearly the favorite. We are 3 years apart, but he developed a superiority complex because I was severely punished if I ever took revenge for his mischief. Back then, it was obvious that my parents cared much more about him because he got the majority of everything unless people pointed it out, which happened quite often by other family members. That's why my parents packed us all up and moved us about 150 kilometers away from them, so they generally only saw us during holidays since it was a 3-hour trip. My brother became physically abusive toward me on several occasions, flirted relentlessly with my first girlfriend to the point where she broke up with me, and laughed at my misfortune. My parents simply told me to toughen up every time I felt upset about it. I was treated equally only when my parents wanted to keep up appearances. I admit it was quite funny to see the faces they put on when they had to treat me the same as my brother on birthdays and Christmas because other people were present. We had very nosy relatives who loved gossiping and dramatizing things, so my parents did everything they could to hide what was really happening and threatened to take away all my stuff if I didn't stay quiet. This led my parents to celebrate even more when I turned 18 and left home because it meant they no longer had to provide for me. I hadn't even finished high school when I left, but sleeping on couches was way better than living with them. I had little contact since I left the house. They didn't even show up for my high school graduation, but I really didn't care. From that point on, I would only see my parents and my brother on holidays like the rest of the family. The start of the pandemic wasn't kind to me. I lost my job and couldn't renew the lease on my condo because my roommate also lost his job, and neither of us could afford the place on unemployment money. It was a 2-bedroom condo that I really loved. As the lease was about to end, my roommate moved out early to live with relatives, and I had to sell almost all my stuff because I was about to be homeless if I didn't minimize my belongings. I really shouldn't have rented such an expensive place, but I liked living the luxurious life until that life wasn't kind to me, and I realized I should have been living in a much cheaper place to save more money as a backup. But I had a plan. I owned a truck simply because I've always loved them. So I found a $1,000 camper in good shape and set it up in my truck to live in it for a while. It was supposed to be temporary, but I ended up living in it for much longer than I thought. I hoped to live in the camper at my parents' house where my brother and his family still reside. But when I asked my parents if I could stay for a bit, they told me they had the house full and didn't want me there. Also, we hadn't gotten along for the last decade. They said they would only allow me to park my camper there if I paid them basically what it would cost to rent an apartment in my area. That was way too much just to park my camper. I was unemployed and trying to save as much of my unemployment money as I could until I could find a new job. I could have lived in an apartment with the rent my parents were asking for. My parents referred to my camper as an eyesore and told me to go take a walk since we couldn't come to an agreement. My sister-in-law thought it was absolutely funny that I had to live in a camper, and my brother joined in, pointing at me and mocking me by calling me a homeless bum. I parked my truck and camper in a store lot to sleep the first night since I had nowhere else to go. I felt terrified that someone might try to break in, of course. I didn't sleep well that night. There was nowhere else to go since any other relatives I had with houses were fairly far away, and all my friends lived in apartments too. I was pretty attached to my area, so I didn't want to leave. I also redirected my mail to a friend's apartment. It was the only way to receive my mail. Finding a stable place to park was quite difficult. I went out looking for work similar to what I had before. I led a nomadic life in my camper for several months. During that time, I had to deal with plenty of things from homeless people and drug addicts to people demanding that I leave because my camper was ugly. At one point, someone who told me to move claimed to be part of a homeowners association, even though I wasn't parked on a street with houses, and when I questioned what association they belonged to, they became incredibly belligerent and threatened me. Anyway, I moved my camper just to avoid trouble. To have a constant supply of electricity, I learned to use a long extension cord to plug it in wherever possible and recharge the batteries of my camper. This meant connecting it to an external outlet of a building when parked on a street. I know it's a pretty bad thing to do, but I had to keep my batteries charged to keep my fridge cool. I had a small solar power bag to recharge my phone, but I didn't have anything like a generator, and generators are loud and require fuel. So I did what I had to do. After months of living like this, I finally managed to get a new job. I had to move to the next town over to find a job that didn't involve retail. I worked retail while in college and promised myself I would never do it again. Although I was almost ready to break that promise, I was still receiving unemployment money, but I didn't have a stable place to live while receiving it, and I didn't want to remain unemployed once it ran out. I was also extremely bored. I had little more to do than read, watch movies on a small portable DVD player, use my phone or laptop, and note where I could park and which local public bathrooms I could use. Somehow, I envied the Japanese for having public restrooms. We could really use things like that around here. When I finally landed a new job, I practically lived in the back of the building in the forgotten old employee parking spaces near the warehouse that no one else seemed to bother using because they were so far back that the area was almost forgotten. My boss and the owner of the company really liked this setup because I was readily available to take any shifts I could get as long as I had slept a bit. They even let me unhook my camper from my truck and put it in one of the spaces so I could drive without it. I'm not sure if this was legal, but no one bothered us about it during the whole time I lived back there. I didn't have to deal with many intruders. There were a few, but the security guards practically threw them out. I was on call almost all the time when they needed me and worked practically every day of the week. My boss allowed me to plug my camper into the building for electricity and water, and I paid a small amount of rent by working for free on Sundays when no one else was in the office except the janitor and the security guard. Beyond that, I usually showered at a friend's apartment or my local gym since the camper didn't have a shower, just a portable toilet. I didn't want to fill it up because emptying it was an unpleasant task, so I used other bathrooms as much as I could. I had a key for the storage area and could go in to use the bathroom anytime. I even got to know the night security guard by name, and he has since become one of my closest friends. My camper was easy to heat in the winter with a small electric heater. However, summers weren't fun because the camper didn't have air conditioning, so I had to get a used portable air conditioner just to make it bearable. I made a lot of extra money and learned new skills from other employees. Eventually, by mid-year, I got a better position in the company as a supervisor and started making a better salary than at my previous job. That's when I decided that I wanted a house. The scare of losing my condo made me realize that I needed something much more stable for the long term. I looked for something close to my job, and just 3 kilometers away, I found a 3-bedroom mobile home on a small lot. I managed to get it for $11,000 less than the asking price, used almost all my savings for a down payment, and was approved for a mortgage finally. I didn't have to live in a camper anymore. There was enough room to back my truck behind the house, remove the camper, and set it up in the backyard. So, I placed it there as its own little shed in case I wanted to use it again. When I was fully settled into the house, I was silly enough to brag about it on my Facebook. My family saw the post, and that's where this really begins. A few weeks later, my parents and my brother, along with his family, came to visit completely unannounced to take a tour of my house. I didn't even give them my address, so I don't know how they found out where I lived. None of my friends admitted it, and no family members visited me before that. So I wonder if they spied on me at work and followed me home or something. It really wouldn't surprise me. When I opened the door, almost everyone barged in like loud tourists and started strolling as if they were in their own house. Everyone kept snooping around, and my sister-in-law had this creepy smile, and only later did I find out why. And that made me angrier than a bull on steroids that just got stung by a wasp. My parents wouldn't stop talking about how much extra space I have now, and that it's too much for someone like me who has no wife or kids. Sure, not now, but maybe someday. And my brother kept commenting on how there was more space than at our parents' house, and my house was closer to his job too, all the warning signs. Eventually, my brother asked to speak to me privately. Everyone else suddenly left the room and gathered on the front porch. That's what finally made me realize they were planning something. My brother, let's call him Dan for simplicity, said that the house was too big for me alone and that I should let him move in with his family because his wife is pregnant with their fourth child and my house is much closer to his job. He pointed out that since I have the camper, I could live in that outside while they live in the main house. And I want to point out that Dan never once mentioned offering to pay rent. I should note that he has a good job too. He started talking about how there would be changes and even curfews, and that I couldn't come in at any time without notice. If it weren't my brother, I would think the person I was talking to had lost their mind. But Dan lost it a long time ago thanks to our parents treating him like he was the center of the universe. I tried to talk, but he kept rambling on as if I had no voice in the matter. There was no way I was going to rent my house or parts of my house to him or anyone else, maybe just to pay off the mortgage more easily, but certainly not to him or his unpleasant wife. I've heard of these kinds of situations so many times, and I never thought I would actually live through it because it seemed so absurd, but my parents, brother, and sister-in-law all fit the profile of a bunch of narcissistic, arrogant lunatics. So, I grabbed my phone and started recording. Then I just held it up. Dan didn't even seem to care or notice that I was doing it, and just sat there with his arms flailing while he talked about all the reasons why he needed my house. Then he moved from saying that to acting like it was already a done deal and tried to reach out for a handshake. That's when I finally showed my determination and said no. And I said it loud enough for Dan to step back for a second. I rarely raised my voice like that because our parents punished me every time I did, but this was my house, not theirs. I stood up and told him that my house was not for sale, and acting like I would let him move in just because they wanted him to wouldn't make it a reality. I bought my house for myself, and it's not my fault that he keeps having more kids and has to keep living with our parents because he can't afford to move out. Dan moved physically close to me as much as he could without touching me, and said that I didn't deserve the house and that he needed a better place for his family. I laughed in his face and told him I deserved it because I worked hard to buy my house. Of course, I deserved it. Dan started yelling that I have no wife or kids and that I don't need all that space, so I could just give it to him. I told him that I wouldn't give him anything, and he didn't even offer to pay me rent if he moved in, so I would still be covering the whole mortgage on my house without being able to live in my own house. Then Dan told me that I shouldn't have to pay rent because his family comes first, and that our parents said this and that I would do it. I yelled back that his word wasn't law or something like that, and I told Dan that they had no right or power to give my house to him. Then, just like it was planned, my parents and my sister-in-law came back through the front door and surrounded me to try to force me to agree. There was a lot of fighting, but to summarize, from this point on, I heard the line, "Just do it for Dan," many more times than I can remember. During the fight, I told everyone that they didn't have a voice in my life or my house and that they should leave before I called the police. My sister-in-law screamed louder than everyone that she was pregnant again, and that I couldn't do this to her. I told her that I didn't do anything to her. She just assumed she could take my house. I had no obligation to her or her family. Then I called her arrogant and said that she never had any respect for me, so I didn't care what she thought or how many kids she had. She wouldn't be living in my house. Well, that made her furious enough to attack me. She gave me a good punch in the face and tried to do more, but my brother held her back. There were kicks and screams. She kept demanding to be let go so she could hit me. The phone I was holding recorded practically everything, so I lifted it and said that I was going to call the police if they didn't leave immediately. My parents told Dan that they were leaving, and then my mom said that I had a week to reconsider. I told her I wouldn't and not to come back. Then I told my sister-in-law that my phone recorded everything, and if she tried anything, I would press charges for assault. She screamed at me and then stormed out, crying loudly with her hands on her face. My mom was the last one to leave the door, and she said I better do this for Dan. And my sister-in-law responded, and I told her that I wouldn't. Update 1. Like I said in the first half of my post, many will find this incredible. Yes, I'm aware that there are already posts online sounding similar. I've seen several of them now, but it's not like those posters have a monopoly on these kinds of situations. If anything surprises me, it's that this site hasn't been used better against these kinds of things since people with rights should be more afraid of it coming to light. But anyway, I don't blame anyone for calling it fake. I would too if I were reading this without knowing. However, after reading this in my first post, you'll know how evil my parents are in my life. They were the root of all evil. They raised my brother into the person he is today and never gave me a real reason for it. And I fear that there may not be one. Some people can't explain why they make decisions like favoritism in children, so all they can do is try to back up the child they backed, which is exactly what my parents tried to do after kicking my parents, my brother, and my sister-in-law out for trying to force me to hand over my new house to my brother. I immediately went to my social media and told the story to the whole family. It spread fairly quickly, but you won't find it now because it was all deleted some time ago, and I put my profile private. I posted about it because I knew the first thing my family would do when they got home would be to try to twist the event to make me the villain, and I was right. But I had about an hour to start before they did, and I had video evidence to back up my story about what they had done. No, I do not plan to show the video here, so don't ask. Being sneaky worked because I got a good number of family members on my side right away. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law must have been ready to write their own post, but it was too late. So they didn't even bother to try to lie too much. My parents, Dan, and my sister-in-law had some flying monkeys supporting them, but not much more. Many others knew how rude they were already, so what happened was something that everyone understood and accepted quickly. There was one person in particular who called me. I don't know who they were, but they shouted at me that I was a horrible brother and needed to make space for a real man of family. I simply hung up and blocked the number. This didn't repeat the following week when my parents showed up with Dan on my front porch, just as they said they would in their previous ultimatum, banging on my door like crazy and pounding on the door until I finally answered. I opened it just a crack, and they tried to barge their way in again, but I had installed a couple of chain locks that prevented them from doing so and even braced my body against the door as a security measure. My father and brother demanded that I let them in, but I told them I was recording everything with my camera and would call the police if they tried to force their way in again. My mother calmed them down, and then in her sickeningly sweet tone, she asked me if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her and the rest to get out and never come back. My mother put on crocodile tears and asked me why I couldn't do this for Dan, because he's my beloved brother. I laughed and then bluntly said that I didn't want him as a brother because he treated me like this for years, and they just encouraged him to do so. They're terrible parents, and he is a terrible brother. Then I told them to leave, or I would call the police. To my surprise, everyone left surprisingly easily, except for my mother's loud crying and the dirty looks from the others. It could be said that making them leave was suspiciously easy. I thought the whole mess was over, but I guess I should have taken them more seriously because they had other stupid plans. I came home later that week on Friday afternoon and found a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. It was Dan and his family moving things in. He just greeted me with a smirking smile when he saw me. I was furious and told him and the rest of his family to stop, but my sister-in-law told me smugly that, like it or not, they were moving in. Then, in the most fake way possible, tilting her head and pouting, she said it was okay because my mom allowed it, and that I should always listen to what my mom tells me. Just hearing those words and looking at her smug face made me boil with rage, so I locked myself in my truck to call the police immediately. When they realized what I was doing, my sister-in-law started banging on my window and yelling at me to stop, that I couldn't do this to them because she and Dan needed the house. She cried out, "Why can't you do this for Dan?" I replied, "It's my expletive house, not yours." Then she threatened to scratch the side of my truck unless I stopped calling the police, all of which the 911 operator heard thanks to the window being slightly open. I told my sister-in-law that if she damaged my truck, I would sue her, and she was smart enough to back off. When the police arrived, Dan and my sister-in-law, along with their kids, had locked themselves inside my house. I told the police what happened and showed them my new driver's license with my current address. Then, when we went to the front door, I saw that they had changed the lock, and the old lock was lying on the porch with the center drilled out, and the drill they used was right next to it with a complete set of drill bits. They couldn't have been any more stupid leaving evidence like that, so I pointed out the broken lock and the drill. Then, I gave the police a rundown of all the events that had occurred before. Well, I guess Dan called our parents at some point after I got home because they showed up while I was talking to the police. My parents immediately lied and started saying that I had agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I said that was a lie easily verifiable one way or another. Yeah, Dan and my sister-in-law finally came out of my house with some papers in hand. They both looked super smug as if they had somehow outsmarted me. In fact, they had fabricated and printed a false rental agreement, but my signature wasn't on it. There was a signature, but it didn't look anything like my handwriting. I don't think either of them had ever seen my signature. So, that was incredibly stupid on their part. I told my parents and Dan that was fraud, and if the police investigated, they would easily find it out, and I didn't think going to jail at a trial would do them any good. It could even land Dan losing his job, which is his only way to support his family. I also said I would get a lawyer and sue for damages if anything of mine went missing, was stolen, or broke, and I would also call Child Protective Services just to be cautious. Dan went pale and looked truly scared when I said all that. But my mother stepped between us and insisted that I should do this for Dan and live in the expletive camper so that they could finally have a family home for just themselves. I yelled back that if she thought it was such a good idea, she could do it for Dan and let Dan have his house all to himself. The police separated my mother from me, and I said I wanted everyone to leave right now or I would file charges. I yelled about how they broke the lock on my front door to get in, that the contract papers were obvious forgeries, that they poorly forged my signature, and that I have video evidence of my sister-in-law attacking me. Those are serious crimes I could use against them if I wanted to, and if they didn't leave, that's exactly what I would do. The only reason I hadn't done it before was for the sake of Dan's children, so they had a chance to get out. As soon as my parents heard that, I think they finally understood that they couldn't force me to do this for Dan. My mother gave up and said she would put an end to this. Then she went over to my sister-in-law and spoke to her quietly for a minute, while my father talked to Dan. My sister-in-law suddenly began to cry loudly and tore the false contract papers into pieces and threw them like confetti, only to be told by an officer to pick up the pieces of paper or be fined for littering. Both officers at this point had expressions of, "I'm not getting paid enough for this." Dan had to start telling his kids to get back to loading their things into the moving truck. All the kids were crying, and the oldest was sobbing that he wouldn't have his own room now. My sister-in-law and Dan gathered their kids to make one last pathetic attempt to blame me with the sad family routine, where everyone gathers in some sort of group hug looking in one direction. I swear, I think they practiced this beforehand. All the kids had the same pleading look with quivering lips. My sister-in-law kept rubbing her pregnant belly and tilting her head to look like a sad puppy dog, and my brother just made the saddest face he could and said, "Please don't do this. We need to live here." But there was no hesitation, and I told them to keep packing. All the kids and my sister-in-law cranked up the crying to the max, and Dan yelled at me, "Are you satisfied with yourself? You've denied us a home because you're too selfish to share." I ended up laughing maniacally and replied that what he was trying to do was take, not share, and that no amount of crying would make me let his family move in because he's no longer my brother. He's just a conceited idiot who thinks he can take whatever he wants from me, like when we were kids. Dan started cursing me with strong words until the police told him to calm down or he would be arrested. He bit his lip and looked like he was a mix of fear and supreme rage. I asked the police to stay until my parents, brother, and sister-in-law had left, and they said they had no intention of leaving until this was resolved. In fact, in the next few minutes, 2 police officers became 4 as more arrived for some reason. That gave my parents additional incentive to leave. I made Dan give me the keys to the new lock he had put on my front door, even though I got another lock the day after anyway, because I didn't know if he had copies of the keys or not. He struggled greatly to give them to me, so instead of handing them over, he threw them down and tossed them into a storm drain, saying to go fetch them myself. But one of the officers scolded him for that and made him go retrieve them. He had to remove the grate just to reach them and got pretty dirty in the process. When he recovered the keys, he just huffed and tossed them into my hand. Then I told everyone to leave and never come back. My mother said I would be disowned for this as if it were some kind of threat to me, and I expressed that then, and in a sarcastically exaggerated tone, I said something like, "Oh no, that means I won't be able to come to any family gatherings with you, where you always treat me badly anyway." Because Dan has always been their favorite. They treated me so poorly growing up that if Dan ever needs an organ donor, I wouldn't give him anything. Then do what they always told me to do when I was mistreated by all of you and just deal with it. My parents were shocked after I said all that, and the quartet of police officers was also looking at them pretty judgmentally. I tell you, if you want to put unpleasant parents like mine in a tight spot, confront them in front of the police because it's likely they won't try anything really stupid at that moment. My mother simply started crying and walked away. My father just stood there staring at me as if he wanted to hit me, and Dan was just holding his kids, looking defeated. Oh, and my sister-in-law was throwing a tantrum on my front lawn. It took a while for everyone to form a line to grab boxes and take their things out of my house. Nothing had been unpacked yet, so everything came out pretty quickly. But while they did it, my mother kept saying it wasn't too late and that I could still do this for Dan several times, each time trying to negotiate more and more to try to change my mind. She said Dan could pay me rent if I let them stay, and when that didn't work, she said I could move back in with them so that Dan could rent my house, and then I wouldn't have to share the building. I told her to shut up and keep packing boxes because I didn't want Dan or his family close. I didn't want his money, and I certainly wouldn't want to live with him or my parents ever again after the way they treated me when I was a child. Making a deal with my parents would be like making a deal with the devil for me. My sister-in-law ended up throwing another tantrum after hearing that and threw a box on the ground, then sat on the floor and had a pity party because she didn't want to share a house with my parents. She just sat there looking angrily and sadly until everyone else was finished. She didn't even want to get up when it was time to leave. They finally took everything out of the house and loaded it into the moving truck, so before they left, I vented one last time to my parents about everything they made me go through growing up, and with 4 police officers right there, they couldn't do much more than stand there and take it. I confronted them about so many things that occurred and even pointed out how they couldn't do something nice for me, like letting me stay in my camper when I was homeless and trying to get by, like how they let Dan and my sister-in-law ridicule me and call me a bum. Well, who's the bum now? They wanted to kick me out of my own house so that Dan could stay in it rent-free. Yet when I needed a place to go, they wanted to kick me out more than I could afford just to park my camper when they knew I was unemployed. There were very judgmental looks from the police. When I said all that, so I put my parents in a tight spot again and asked them what I did beyond being born to deserve being treated so poorly. Because when I finally have a little success in life, they want to take it from their favorite son. They'd rather give everything to Dan and not have anything for me. I bought my house with the money I earned. I owe them nothing, and I won't ask for anything from them ever again, because clearly I will never be more than a doormat or a cash cow in their eyes. I got no responses from them. They just stood there like fish out of water. So I kept ranting and asked them what in God's name made them think they were such good parents after all that. My father was red as a tomato, but more out of embarrassment than anger this time, and my mother was crying, saying I was a horrible person. I wholeheartedly agreed that she is a horrible person. They all are, and I bet they're going to hell for it too. They were bad people, and everyone knew it. But if I had confronted them with all these things privately rather than publicly, they would have just gotten mad at me and still acted like I was in the wrong. They simply maintained denial for so long that it became part of who they are. My mother buried her face in my father's jacket to cry, and my father looked more defeated than I'd ever seen him. Dan and his family avoided me completely while they finished putting everything back into the moving truck. They made sure to gather vehicles, and my sister-in-law just stood staring at me with malice until my brother finally convinced her to drive the minivan home. As soon as everyone left, I got back online and told the whole truth about what happened. My parents were too far gone to even attempt to defend their actions this time. While the family was somewhat divided before this incident, it now became a landslide in my favor. Almost the entire family sided with me after this incident, and those who didn't just didn't pick sides at all. No matter how hard my parents tried to use the line, "We did it for Dan," nobody was listening. So, whatever remaining family support they had was already gone. Many in the family who I thought would not be on my side were, including the old flying monkeys. At that point, I offered to host half the family for the upcoming Christmas Eve at my new house. My parents were not invited. Surprisingly, I wasn't blocked on my brother and sister-in-law's profile, and I saw that my sister-in-law had her fourth child in early November. They still live at my parents' house. I'm pretty sure they knew I was watching because my sister-in-law kept making passive-aggressive posts every couple of weeks or so about not having enough space while living with my parents, probably to see if I could still feel guilty. And I'm sure she's driving my mother and father insane because they have no peace or quiet in their old age with 3 noisy, annoying kids, a mentally unstable sister-in-law, and a newborn baby in the house all at once. Maybe they could move into a camper in their own backyard and let Dan completely take over their house. They could get some peace then. So there was supposed to be more, but this post got too long, so I'll post part 3 later. Update 2, trying to keep things to 2 posts, but I realized while compiling this that my laptop is 3 years old and runs Windows 10. Yes, I'm aware of doorbell cameras. That will be the first thing I get. For those who keep saying that I should have had my brother and sister-in-law arrested, the only reason I didn't is that they are parents that their kids need. If Dan were arrested, he would likely lose his job, and without that, his family would have no money. And my sister-in-law has a baby that's only a month old right now. None of them need to end up in jail, but you don't need jail for revenge. The police can help, yes, but I got my revenge without filing a police report. I will be compassionate again. It's more than likely that I won't, and they know it. I decided to wait to publish until after the new year in case more things happened. And that's how readers before know. My sister-in-law was making passive-aggressive posts online that were clearly aimed at me, especially after my sister-in-law had her 4th child in November. She was posting the same repetitive nonsense over and over again, finding semi-creative ways to rephrase it, but basically regurgitating that she was tired of living with my parents, that there wasn't enough space, that she needed her own house, blah, blah, blah. I know I sound dismissive, but live through what I've lived with these people, and you'd be ready to sarcastically play tiny violins in front of them. They're simply that bad. And since I waited until January to post an update, more happened, just like I thought. As mentioned, I invited half the family to a Christmas party at my house, and all the guests came, although it was quite a long drive of about 3 or 4 hours for them. They wanted to come and show me their support. I was praised by them for how hard I worked to get a house on my own, and they regretted all I had to go through. They asked me why I didn't just take my camper and drive the 3 hours back to them instead of living practically homeless for so long. I had to timidly admit that I was quite attached to living around here and had the best job opportunities in this area. My hometown doesn't have many job opportunities in my field if it has any, and I wanted to pave my way as much as I could. That was a response they generally accepted. We went on to have a lovely party, the best one I'd been to in years. Some relatives even brought CDs of great Christmas albums, and I must say that the one my uncle brought by Ray Charles was my favorite. He sings Christmas songs like no one else I've ever heard. It was a grand and happy moment. I felt like for once I could forget my past problems and enjoy the moment. But I wouldn't be writing this if it had stayed that way. 2 hours after the party, you know who showed up? My parents, brother, and sister-in-law came in trying to look all smiles. They didn't even knock. They just walked in through the front door as if they had the right to be there. I turned off the music and told them to leave immediately. They begged to stay, saying they brought gifts. One of my uncles stood up and shouted at them before I even had another chance to speak, and he said they didn't deserve to be in my home or in my life after what they tried to do months before. He was backed up by several other relatives. It's worth mentioning that this guy is my mother's brother, and he used to care about her a lot until he found out what went on between my parents and me. My grandparents, my mother's parents, as old as they are, rushed between us and told my parents that if they wanted to make peace with me, it was too soon, and that they had never been more disappointed in them than they were last year. They had hidden their favoritism toward my brother from curious gazes for too long, but nobody was being fooled anymore, and they needed to make a serious effort to treat me like a son if they ever wanted to be back in my life again. Then they turned to Dan and my sister-in-law and told them that they had seen the repetitive nonsense that my sister-in-law keeps posting, and they are sick of it and just let it go. My house wasn't going to become their new home. My sister-in-law went back to her old standard of crying and had a pity party about how she should be the one living here and not me. She dropped into a chair to have a meltdown and said it wasn't fair that I had this house all to myself when I don't have a family of my own, and she has 4 children who need more space. She just wanted a better place to live and feel like a real mother. It was mean of me, but I pointed out loudly that she is a bad mother because she lets my mom do most of the child rearing while she sits around all day drinking, playing on her phone, or going out and spending all of Dan's money, and then has the nerve to complain about it. I even joked that I was surprised her baby isn't getting drunk on her breast milk since she drinks so much alcohol, which I admit was a bit too far since I got some looks. My sister-in-law demanded to know if I was calling her a bad mother. I said the evidence speaks for itself, and if she wanted to be able to move out of our parents' house one day, then she needs to put her college degree to good use, get a job, and learn to save money. My mother already does most of the childcare for my brother's kids anyway, so she would have plenty of time after her baby grew a little. My brother's oldest son, who is 7, ran over to start kicking me and yelling at me for yelling at his mom, and he kept telling me that his mom said I was the bad guy that made her cry and didn't let them live here. That's when my brother grabbed his kid to pull him away, but all the other relatives intervened again. This turned into a sort of family intervention against my sister-in-law and my brother. She was crying, her new baby was crying, her kids were crying. Heck, even Dan was almost crying from the verbal beatdown they were giving him. He ended up sitting on the ottoman where I keep the shoes by the front door, looking like a complete wreck. He couldn't look anyone in the eye and couldn't even say 2 words to me. Not with the whole house full of angry people ready to judge him if he tried to let his golden child out again. If they weren't there to step in his way, I bet this would have turned into a repeat of when he tried to give me orders to stay in my house months before. At this point, however, he had been so humiliated that his reputation and that of my parents and the family were completely destroyed now that all masks were off. Not long after my parents, brother, and sister-in-law left defeated, the party resumed, and we all avoided talking about what had just happened for the rest of the night, given that most of the adults had been drinking. Everyone stayed overnight at my house, and I even let some sleep in the camper, so there would be enough space. I admit it also works well as a good guest house. My relatives wanted to visit before and said they couldn't believe I'd been living in it for about 2 years. I had many questions about it, like how summer and winter were, so I woke up before everyone else on Christmas morning and had a fresh coffee maker and some ibuprofen ready for that eggnog hangover some of them had. They praised me for being a much nicer host than my parents ever were. We all agreed to do this again next Christmas. After Christmas, my sister-in-law finally stopped making posts that were clearly indirect toward me and deleted all the old ones, too. But shortly after the new year, she made a new post complaining about how she had tried to convince my parents to get a camper like mine so they could set it up in the backyard, and then Dan and his family could use the whole house as their family home. Well, the taste of her own medicine is never so much fun because my parents vehemently rejected that idea. I heard that nobody is going to kick them out of their own house, let alone their master bedroom. The post was online for only a couple of days before my sister-in-law deleted it, and she has barely posted anything since then. She loves to complain, but if a tree falls and no one is around to hear it. Well, I suppose my sister-in-law realized it doesn't make sense to do it when no one is listening to her. Dan can't afford to move his family out on his income in the short term. If they end up expecting another child in the coming years, I wouldn't be surprised. Things have calmed down for me since then, and I even invited friends over for a poker night. I suck at poker because I can never remember anything, but whatever. We had beer, junk food, and a good time. For guys who just want to have a good time and get drunk. I think maybe this summer I'll think about dating someone. It's not like I'm getting any younger. I cross my fingers that everything goes well. My camper's now just inactive in my backyard, and I admit there were days when I went out just to spend time in it. I lived in it for 2 years. It's like my second home, and maybe one day I'll actually be able to use it for camping as it was intended. I've never been camping. My parents considered it a waste of time, so it will be a completely new experience for me. This marks more or less the end of what happened. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law have been completely avoiding me. In fact, they seem to have gone back to acting like I didn't exist, like they did before I bought a house. It doesn't bother me at all. It's better this way, but inevitably, they will come back somehow. I just wonder what nonsense they will come up with next. If anything notable happens like all this again, I'll make another post if this account is still active. Update 3. This won't surprise some of the people who commented on my previous posts because my parents did some of the exact things they said they would, which was to want my money or my signature. I was expecting the classic lines from narcissists saying that I owed them or giving me some socialist nonsense about sharing the wealth, but that was just my imagination running wild. The resulting situation was something similar to that, but much calmer. I suppose you could say they seemed to know better than to push me too much and mainly aimed for pity. It started when my parents contacted me recently through social media and asked for a meeting in a public place of my choosing. It seemed like a trap. But I wasn't scared. In fact, I found it amusing. They know they no longer need to mess with me, so I could only wonder what they wanted this time. I chose a local restaurant, and we met there. Dan was with them, but he stayed quiet most of the time. We had awkward hellos, ordered some drinks, and then got to the point. My parents begged me to help Dan get his own apartment so he could finally move out. Apparently, Dan's credit isn't so good. I wonder why that could be. Maybe it's because his wife regularly drains him dry. Well, they asked if I could help either by providing some capital or signing as a co-signer for the apartment and helping pay rent. I simply said no to both things. That's when Dan spoke up, angrily shouting that I have plenty and that I don't have a family to support like he does, that I needed to help save money for his family since I don't have mine. I laughed and asked where they were when I needed their help. Oh, that's right. They laughed at me for being homeless, or should we go further back in my childhood? I'd love to dive deep into that with many ears listening, and plenty of witnesses around my mother grabbed my hand and begged me not to talk about any of that. My father and Dan just looked the other way and didn't say anything. I'm pretty sure they wanted to say something like they used to, but they held back. I asked if they thought I was rich or something, and their looks said it all. When I told them I didn't have that kind of money, they looked at me like deer caught in the headlights of a car. I explained how much I managed to save for the down payment on my house, how I had to live and work hard to save that much so quickly, and then how I spent almost all of it on the down payment for my house. I'm still in the process of recovering financially. Sure, I had monthly income to save, but most of it went straight to my savings. I asked Dan what his annual salary was, and when he told me, I pointed out that it was slightly higher than mine. Then, broadly outlining things, I did math in front of my parents on how roughly 70% of my income goes to my mortgage, insurance, gas, internet, phone, food, and other expenses. And then there's only about 30% at most that I can put into savings. I need that savings to get by and to make sure I have savings to fall back on. My truck is from the 90s. If it breaks down, I would need money to fix or replace it. And there are other things that one would need an emergency fund for, like home repairs, medical expenses, taxes, lawyers, or anything in general where you need cash quickly when it's an unexpected and sudden expenditure. So as you can see, I simply can't afford to give Dan money, and I also refuse to sign as a co-signer for anything because that would leave me on the hook for any bill Dan couldn't or wouldn't pay. Then I pointed out that's probably why my parents didn't sign as co-signers for Dan's apartment a long time ago. My mother just started crying again. I was practically one step ahead of them in all of this. I'm not an ATM and I'm not a fool, and I stated that directly to their faces. I expected my father to get mad at me as he always does, but this time, well, he didn't. I've known this man to blow up at the slightest provocation of not helping my brother throughout my entire life. But this time, he just didn't. Not even a grimace on his face. The only way I could describe the expression he had was regret and defeat. Maybe regret for being an expletive parent, Or maybe regret because he can no longer intimidate me. Who knows? Either way, my parents really couldn't argue with me, and I wasn't going to give them money. Dan simply got up and said this was a waste of time and that he was leaving. My mother apologized for him, but Dan still wanted to leave. Then, just to be nice, I offered to buy them a round of soup and salad, all you can eat while we were there. I guess they couldn't refuse free food since we hadn't ordered anything but drinks up until then, and they stayed. I tried to talk about anything other than money. Dan stayed silent and was either eating his food or looking at his phone, but my parents simply awkwardly chatted with me. They brought up that they had recently joined a local Christian church and that they had been going for the last 2 weeks. I said that was great for them, and of course, they started trying to advertise that they would like me to go too. I simply said no thanks, and they were smart enough not to press further. When the meal ended, Dan left a $5 bill on the table as a tip and walked out, without saying another word to me or anyone. My mother just excused his behavior, and we all parted ways. That was more or less it. There wasn't much dramatization as I thought there would be, but this is still a lot better than how things used to be with my parents and brother. As for my sister-in-law, well, she's been regularly complaining online about my parents. She doesn't really seem to like the fact that she is no longer the queen of the house, and I think her toxicity has finally affected them. Why else would they be so desperate to crawl back to me? My sister-in-law really wants my parents to move into a camper like I had to do to make space in the house, and they always tell her no. However, she seems to have a following of like-minded people because now and then I get messages from someone I don't know who is determined to attack me for not giving my house to my sister-in-law. I no longer bother arguing with these people. I simply block them and move on. Although there was a persistent troll who had my phone number and would call from a different number each time. Yes, this seems to be the same person who called me before to tell me I needed to make space for a real man of the family. Like Dan. But I care little for these calls. However, they seem to have diminished, if not completely ceased, because I made it clear to that person that they were just wasting my time. The last time they called was earlier this month, and it has been quiet since then. Update 4. Well, I thought I'd wait about half a year after the original post to update everyone, but it turns out it's been longer than that. Yes, things have gotten worse. But not really for me. For the most part, I'm doing pretty well. Almost unscathed since last Christmas. Aside from the time my parents and Dan came to ask me for money, as my last post recounted, and a recent confrontation between my sister-in-law and me that you'll read about. I got some cameras for my house, including a doorbell camera on the front door. I didn't tell my family about the cameras just in case, but so far, no one has attempted a burglary. I think the way I outed them all before scared them enough to leave me alone for the most part. Anyway, I decided to rent out 2 of the bedrooms in my house, one to a close friend and the other to a friend of his. Both have been fantastic tenants. They know how to keep quiet and leave me alone most of the time, and they even have little fridges they keep in their rooms to avoid having to store any of their drinks in the main refrigerator. The deal I gave them on rent was too good to pass up. It boosted my monthly income significantly, and even after taxes, I'm still saving decent amounts in the bank every month since the rental income pays for a good chunk of my mortgage. You're probably all wondering how my parents, brother, and sister-in-law took the news that I'm renting those rooms to friends. Well, the answer is, they didn't take it well. My father and Dan kept their distance, but my sister-in-law flipped out, which made my mother come crying to me about how I could have rented those rooms to Dan and his family instead. We had a little argument where I pointed out that in the first place, they broke into my house before to try to steal it. She wouldn't want someone who did that to move in with her. Plus, there wasn't enough space for me, Dan, and his whole family in my house. Not that I would ever share a roof with all of them anyway. It's a 3-bedroom mobile home, no less. I have the master bedroom and an adjacent bathroom. That would have left just 2 small rooms for Dan, my sister-in-law, and 4 kids. Not to mention they would be incredibly annoying all the time. Also, she knows full well that I can't be close to my sister-in-law because she intentionally provokes me, and they all mocked me when I was homeless before. My mother had some tearful excuses for a while, but she eventually let it go and admitted that she was just desperate. Update 5. My parents found out I was renting rooms because my sister-in-law basically stalked me in some way, then told my parents about it, and then my parents contacted me, and then my mother came crying about it. Since then, my parents haven't bothered me once about the house. So, things are going well for me. For my parents and Dan, not so much. It turns out my sister-in-law is one heck of a worse person than I even thought. I already knew she was a manipulator, a self-inflicted victim, and a drama addict. But she fell even lower because Dan's youngest child turned out not to be his. Yes, you all read that correctly. My sister-in-law had an affair, which in hindsight isn't that surprising, and something that some people on here totally predicted months ago. After being discovered, my sister-in-law was kicked out of the family. Dan just finalized his divorce, which actually worked out in his favor since we live in a no-fault state. Dan also sued to have his name removed from the youngest child's birth certificate, and won. Basically, after the incident where my parents tried to force me to hand over my house, things got rather tumultuous at their house. My sister-in-law blamed me a lot. She was convinced somehow that I had tons of money, like I'd won the lottery or something, and that I should share the wealth. Apparently, it was her idea for them to come to my Christmas party because she hoped everyone would try to win me over. It was also her idea to have my parents and Dan try to get money from me for an apartment, so she really got a surprise when Dan and my parents told her how my finances really were all this time. She had completely immersed Dan and my parents into her toxic mentality and only fed their narcissism with her own. So blaming me made everyone blame me. That was until what happened in front of the police when they tried to steal my house. That's when the real downfall of my sister-in-law began. My parents and Dan were hesitant about coming to my Christmas party after the way they were outed, but my sister-in-law convinced them to bring together some cheap gifts that they could scrounge together at the last minute and just show up because I would never throw them out. Well, boy, was that a mistake. She bet on that plan, and I, with the complete blessing of everyone I'd invited, threw her and the rest of them out. Her plan certainly backfired spectacularly. I guess being reprimanded by the family at my party not only worsened my parents' reputation, but actually initiated a wake-up call for them to stop listening to my sister-in-law. As I said in my last post, my parents decided to return to church. Maybe because last year I said they would probably go to hell for their actions. I can't say that's the real reason, but you have to admit it would be quite satisfying if it were. Even though my parents hadn't been to church in 2 decades before returning, I don't think going is a bad idea for them. They need to understand that going doesn't give them a new opportunity for everything they've done in the past. But I have some hope that at least they are trying, because my parents came to my house without Dan to personally apologize to me after seeing an animated video of my first 3 posts. That's right. They've known about this Reddit account for a long time. They also know everything I'm saying. Yes, they're not happy about it, but I feel everyone here deserves an update since it's important for my parents and Dan. Even seeing an animated video of themselves and their actions was an excellent way for them to see what kind of people they really are, and they came to apologize to me afterward. I had never seen my father apologize like that to someone, and the man is not a good actor, so this felt genuine. They fully recognized what they did to me, and that there is no excuse for any of it. They even described themselves as narcissists and admitted the truth that they severely harmed me. Then they kept blaming my sister-in-law for many things. Yes, they left her hanging, but it's not like she wasn't culpable for everything. My parents have also been going to therapy for a while and offered family group therapy. But I rejected it since I'm not ready for that in the short term. Dan himself hasn't apologized to me for anything, but he seemed extremely regretful every time the past was mentioned. Meanwhile, Dan's marriage with my sister-in-law went completely downhill. It wasn't so much a collapse, it was a waterfall. Without me as a scapegoat, black sheep, ATM that they could laugh at or try to get money from, and after the public humiliation on social media from my posts on Reddit and the animated video online, my sister-in-law finally released enough of her toxicity in Dan and my parents for them to realize she isn't the person they thought she was. Their denial had been strong, but my sister-in-law's superiority complex was stronger. I've had many thoughts of lightsabers clashing over this drama. My sister-in-law dressed as a Sith wielding a lightsaber that looks like a giant lipstick or something. I imagine there are a ton of puns and jokes to make there, but I didn't really bother thinking much more into it. But as you can imagine, things just got worse because my sister-in-law kept looking for other ways to get what she wanted. She kept showing ads for campers and used RVs to try to get my parents to buy one to live in so they could have the main house, and she kept doing this no matter how many times they told her to stop. She even tried saying that my parents should just buy an RV and have a life on the road like normal old people do. That was stupid, even for my sister-in-law. The opposite was suggested that Dan and my sister-in-law should buy an RV to live in it. My sister-in-law basically said she shouldn't have to do that because she's the mom. She was basically boasting about the fact that she thought she had total parental authority over everyone because all the kids in the house are hers. And when my sister-in-law didn't get what she wanted, she actually took her baby and abandoned the house to disappear for several days. They knew she was okay because her phone kept working, and she would respond to texts with short but passive-aggressive replies. When she came back, she was even more bitter because no one cared while she was gone. My sister-in-law also refused to go to church, but Dan went with our parents and brought his kids too, except for the youngest, since my sister-in-law refused to let him take the baby anywhere. Personally, I don't go to church. I believe in God and all that, but I just don't like church also. I never did well as a kid. Update 6. Just so everyone understands, a lot of this info came from Dan and my parents, so I'm just relaying what I know. Things really got ugly when Dan suddenly accused his wife of being unfaithful in March. This surprised us all because we thought he was completely submissive to her, but no, not anymore. Everyone knows how he treated me when she was against him. Well, his wife was not forgiven at all. She started putting together the pieces about her cheating after he finally stopped being so naive and secretly did DNA tests on all his kids. 3 of the kids are his, but the youngest, the baby, isn't as a reference. Dan and I both have fairly dark straight hair that's almost black, just like our parents. And my sister-in-law has straight, pretty dark hair too. But the baby's hair is lighter and a little curly. At first, Dan thought it was because of the baby's age. My sister-in-law downplayed it and said it would darken over time, but the baby's hair never darkened. I suppose that was the biggest clue for Dan. He confronted his wife with the DNA results in front of our parents, and she broke down crying, saying it was a mistake. My sister-in-law resorted to all the denial tactics, gradually revealing the truth and manipulating reality, but Dan didn't let himself be fooled. He had detailed evidence of her infidelity with phone records, messages he obtained from her phone, bank statements, and the DNA proof. He even identified the man with whom she was cheating, who is probably the father since he has the curly hair of a much lighter color. The evidence against her was crystal clear, and Dan said she was so bad at hiding her affair that she didn't even have trouble finding out once he started looking. My parents demanded that my sister-in-law leave the house immediately. That's when she went crazy, first shouting, but then quickly becoming physical. My mother had to call the police, and yes, my sister-in-law got arrested. She scratched both Dan and my father with her long fake nails, and even injured her eldest son in the crossfire by hitting him hard enough to give him a black eye and a bloody nose when he tried to intervene. Dan was clever enough to have his phone recording nearby when he confronted her, so the police had everything they needed to arrest her for assault. My sister-in-law's parents had to drive over there to pay her bail, then came back for the baby's stuff and her car too. A couple of days after my sister-in-law got out on bail, she showed up at my house because apparently I was next on her list. As soon as I opened the door, she launched into a delirious rant where she accused me of posting on Reddit, then said I was the bane of her existence. I'm not sure, but I think she might have been under the influence of something because this seemed especially crazy to her, and her eyes didn't look good. She claimed that moms with little kids are the most sacred thing in the world, then screamed that giving up my house shouldn't have been too much to ask because keeping the family together was the least I could have done, and if I had done that, her family would still be together. When I tried to talk while she was saying all of that, she actually tried to push me and cover my mouth. She even had her hand ready as if she was prepared to scratch me. Well, that went about as well with me as you can guess. I'm not exactly someone you can threaten, and I told her that I would call the police if she didn't get her hands off me. At that very moment, I also told her that everything was being recorded on my doorbell camera. She started to panic the moment she heard the word camera. Then, I ended up wrecking her egoism, because she is exactly that. She didn't work to get anything she has. She cheated on her husband and got pregnant by her lover. She made my mother do most of the childcare and spent Dan's money until they were in financial trouble and acted entitled to my home to the point of trying to steal it. I told her she was selfish and that she is a greedy person blinded by narcissism. Then, I told her to stop blaming me for her actions and that she should never show up at my house again. Getting all that information was practically everything my sister-in-law needed to hear before jumping back into her car, starting it up, and speeding away. This was finally the last straw for me. Now that she was separated from Dan, I finally went to the police and filed a report against her for harassment and the assault she made against me last year, and the fact that she laid hands on me in my front porch just made it worse. The police now have everything on record, and I gave them copies of the video Dan had for his divorce lawyer. And yes, I filed for a restraining order against my sister-in-law. It was granted easily, since it was evident that the woman is unstable. She hasn't made any posts on social media about me since then that I can see, but that's only because she put her profile on private. I hope her game of blame has stayed in the past. Either way, she's left me alone. My sister-in-law was still with her lover during the divorce. At that time, she didn't have a realistic idea of what kind of man he was, but anyone who gets involved with another person's spouse and has a kid with them really doesn't have many scruples right from the start. Once the divorce was underway, my sister-in-law admitted that Dan simply was no longer man enough for her because he couldn't afford to give her the lifestyle she wanted. In fact, she saw herself as worthy of being a trophy wife and deserved to be with someone wealthy. Dan said she made a fool out of herself and laughed at her. He said she wasn't even close to being attractive enough to be a trophy wife, not to mention any other flaws my sister-in-law had. She ended up humiliated over this and ran crying back to her parents' house. My sister-in-law was forced to work at the family business because Dan no longer gave her access to his bank accounts. She had already maxed out all the credit cards he had given her before, and she complained about having to work for her parents despite having a college degree. But I think they were the only ones who would hire her anyway since she has a criminal record and a decade-long gap in her resume. I heard Dan say that his in-laws were also very disappointed in her, but that was just a rumor. They could be just as bad as she is for all I know. Anyway, the divorce drama really took off once it started. Update 7. This is what the divorce was like for my brother Dan. Dan's attorney pulled some strings to get the divorce started as quickly as possible, but it cost him. I don't know the more specific details or how much it cost in total. They never told me. My sister-in-law, on the other hand, ended up in a really bad financial situation. You know what happens when you back an animal into a corner? It fights back, but the law wasn't on her side, just like her dwindling finances. My sister-in-law's parents had to pay for her a lawyer, but not a very good one. Besides, she brought her lover to the divorce court to testify on her behalf. This guy was a real piece of work. He had a silver tongue and a charming smile he tried to use to his advantage. He claimed that my sister-in-law had been hurt by an incompetent husband, which is why she sought refuge in another man. He claimed he was ready to assume responsibility for the child she had with my sister-in-law. But my sister-in-law would still need alimony to support herself and take care of such a child. He mentioned that since Dan was still on the birth certificate at that time, alimony should be one of his obligations. Dan said this guy used grandiose words and a charming smile, but he seemed to be especially stupid, and that's coming from Dan, which says a lot. The judge didn't get seduced in the slightest and told the silver-tongued guy that he was a hypocrite for saying he was ready to assume responsibility for the child, while also reaching out for money from the man whose marriage he helped ruin. That shut him up. Dan was prepared to sue his wife's lover for alienation of affection too, but that didn't prosper. I suppose it would have been Dan's responsibility to prove how much she loved her before the affair began. But after the mask came off, and we saw her true self, we're not so sure if she really loved him at all, or if she just liked having a food ticket in her hand. Someone here pointed out that my sister-in-law was probably still having kids to avoid getting a job, and you might have been right. Anyway, my sister-in-law tried to drag out the divorce, but Dan's lawyer and the judge largely prevented it. I swear Dan must have gotten pretty lucky because he got one of the worst judges who had no comprehension for cheaters in the state, and all the evidence we had against my sister-in-law made it easy to prevent her from playing the victim. So instead, she just let her true self out, since she didn't have to keep hiding it anymore. The court had all the records provided by Dan and me, police reports, pictures, and recordings, to prove she was an abusive narcissist. There was a mountain against my sister-in-law that she had no way to overcome or work around. She tried to resist the mountain, but that was an avalanche zone. In the end, my sister-in-law agreed to end things quickly. Dan ends up with 75% of the credit card debt, had her name removed from the birth certificate of the baby from the affair, and my sister-in-law left with only partial custody of her kids, no alimony, but also without most of the credit card debt she accumulated being legally employed by her parents. She had her own income to start paying off her debts. She can see her other kids almost any time she wants and take them on the weekends, but for some reason, she has made very few attempts, even to see them. She took them out for fast food a few times, but never took them to her house. The kids are back in school now, so it gives her even fewer opportunities to see them. One would think her parents would want to see their grandkids, but they haven't contacted Dan about it. They barely even saw Dan's kids before all this either. Now they may not even bother seeing them. Do they hate kids or something? Even Dan doesn't know. But he tells me his in-laws were always indifferent toward him anyway. As for Dan, well, he once loved his wife very much, so his wife's betrayal sent him into drinking heavily. To backtrack to the night of his confrontation with his wife, he came to me half-dazed with a bottle of whiskey in his hand and his face all scratched and covered in bandages. I wouldn't say he was drunk yet, but it scared me to see him like that. At first, then I scolded him for driving under the influence, but that didn't mean much to him compared to the betrayal of his future ex-wife. We spent a few hours in my camper so that we wouldn't disturb my tenants while Dan was drinking whiskey straight from the bottle and crying, saying he's a fool and regretted marrying my sister-in-law. Almost every time he mentions my sister-in-law now, he simply calls her that. So, that's his nickname for his ex now. Ironically, this time together was the closest Dan and I had been in 15 years. Although he didn't exactly apologize to me, he did call himself a miserable human being with a terrible taste in women. Then he said, "At least I didn't make his mistakes." After all that he did previously, he was still my younger brother. I couldn't risk letting him drive home, so I told him to stay the night. I managed to take his keys away from him. Then I prepared the bunk in my camper for him to use. After all, I rented my extra rooms out, and he wasn't in a condition to drive home. If he took an Uber, he'd have to pay for it and then come back for his car later. He was still depressed, crying, and didn't want our parents or his kids seeing him like this. Sincerely, I feared he might do something incredibly stupid if I let him go. So putting him in the camper was the best option. Just because I let him in doesn't mean I suddenly trust him. It was better for him to clear his head in the camper. We both spent time in the camper playing games and watching movies on my portable DVD player. Poker isn't fun with just two people. An old maid was boring, fortunately. I had a deck of Uno and an old battleship game that he really liked. That was enough to keep him distracted until he finally was willing to lay down after running out of whiskey and vomiting a lot into a bucket. Anyway, he didn't oppose sleeping in my camper. In fact, he thought it was a brilliant idea. Dan had many questions for me about how I'd lived in the camper for so long, and I answered them all just to keep him occupied. But I too needed to go to sleep since I had to get up early. So I left him with my portable DVD player and a couple of movies. That way he could entertain himself for a bit if he managed to stay awake before I went to work in the morning. I came in while Dan was passed out in there and left him a bottle of ibuprofen, an energy drink on the countertop of the little kitchen in the camper, along with the keys to his car and a note explaining that he should go out the back door of the patio. He left without problems around 1:30 in the afternoon. A month later, after being kicked out, Dan came to ask me to borrow my camper. I guess he found it more comfortable than I thought when he slept in it. He fully admitted he hadn't asked before out of pride, and with his future ex-wife out of the house, he decided to give up his room to his son. He has 2 girls and a boy. The kids had to share a room until that moment. They only had curtains to divide the boy's half of the bedroom, but the boy often slept on the couch to avoid his sisters. I know the poor kid was really desperate for his own room, so I guess Dan finally decided to make a better decision as a father and came to ask me to borrow my camper. If he could have afforded it, he would have bought one of his own instead of depending on me. He even told me he hadn't even had the chance to use the camper for real camping, but I caved and let him borrow it since it was for a good cause. He promised to buy his own in due time. Anyway, I didn't charge him rent for the camper. Dan is already in a financial hole right now. The divorce drained him, and I've learned that I get much better results with family lately. If I'm not resentful, I loaded my camper onto the back of my parents' property, where my father installed a 30-amp switch, so it has enough power for Dan to use heat and air conditioning when needed. I missed the camper after all the time living in it. In some way, it felt like part of me. Basically, the only reason I do anything for my parents or Dan is for the kids' sake, as I've formed a bond with them. I know I might not get the RV back for quite some time, and probably not in the condition I lent it out, but I've warned Dan and my parents that they will be financially responsible for any damage to the RV and its maintenance while they have it. I also took plenty of photos and videos with timestamps of the inside and outside of the RV before lending it out, so I can prove its condition before it left. Dan even recorded a video with me agreeing to my terms, so that's as valid as a contract. With the financial exhaustion of the divorce, Dan won't be able to get his own place for years. Although it seems he has no complaints about living in the RV, I'm not sure if he really likes it or if he's just pretending, but I can assume it reminds him of the cabins we had in the backyard when we were kids. I've gotten a lot of praise from extended family for lending it out. Now, many of them call me the good brother that Dan doesn't deserve. Anyway, I think getting rid of my sister-in-law was a big first step in repairing the family overall. I still care very little about my brother and my parents after how they treated me throughout my life, but I won't let Dan's kids suffer for it. Those kids really have clicked with me. They're happy to see me when I visit or when I go by. I've even taken care of them a few times now that they no longer have their mother's toxic presence around. They've become much kinder kids, especially toward me. I'm really enjoying being an uncle now. My mother still does most of the raising of my nieces and nephews, and has been as kind as possible to stay on my good side. My dad often seems very defeated in my presence, but otherwise he's been quiet and stoically calm or just kind toward me, though he won't talk much to me. That's still a lot better than before. At least I'm not dropping my guard. Anyway, my parents seem happier that my sister-in-law is gone. They often say they don't know what they saw in her. My mom especially. Because they clashed a lot over who was the mom in the house for a long time. Now, for the final part. At the same time the divorce was happening, Dan filed to have his name removed from the birth certificate of the child who wasn't his. My sister-in-law didn't want to change it because it meant Dan would stop paying child support. However, a paternity test was ordered by the court for the man identified as the baby's father. I was ready to laugh, in case it turned out he wasn't the father either, but he was. And Dan's lawyer had a long conversation with his ex's lawyer. My sister-in-law had no valid arguments, and Dan was ready to make her situation worse. She didn't have the financial resources to keep fighting, so she agreed to change the birth certificate. The man who got her pregnant took on his financial responsibility as a father, but in the end he didn't stay with my sister-in-law. He contacted Dan through his lawyer to tell him that he broke up with her and wouldn't bother him again. I checked the social media of that guy after Dan provided the link, and the guy was upset because now he was financially responsible for a child he never planned to have. He says he's too young for this, but according to what Dan's lawyer found, that guy is just over 40. He looks younger than he is, but he's by no means a young man. Shortly after, he made his profile private. My sister-in-law did the same long before, so I don't have any more information to give. This may be the end. My sister-in-law is no longer an issue. My parents and my brother finally made a real effort to be better people. Surprisingly, I'm happy as an uncle, and my house is still my house. Update 8. My sister-in-law saw my posts on Reddit. She can't contact me in any way except through a lawyer due to the restraining order against her. She probably can't afford a lawyer right now anyway, since the divorce left her financially strained. So, she complained to Dan about it, and demanded that he tell me to delete my Reddit account. But Dan not only read my recent posts, he doesn't care anymore. He said they serve as a reminder of the jerk he used to be, and they don't keep him up at night. Plus, I've helped him, despite everything he's done to me, so he won't be bothered by it. My parents also made sure to treat Dan and me more equally when I'm around, though my dad still remains a man of few words when I'm around. Someone pointed out that after all this time treating me the opposite of Dan, my dad no longer knows how to connect with me. And I think they're right. but it doesn't bother me the way he is now. My mom has also developed the habit of apologizing for everything in my presence. Dan told me that both she and my father have been scolded a lot by family and their counselor, and now my mom feels the need to apologize for everything. This is a huge contrast to how they used to treat me. Also, I didn't mention earlier what my sister-in-law thought about Dan borrowing my RV so her son could have his old room. Well, like a stereotypical bully, she despised him and mocked him for living like a homeless person, according to her. But Dan took it calmly and asked if she was done yet because he knew that's how she would react and he just doesn't care about her anymore. She's practically dead to him, and her insults fell on deaf ears. Then, he pointed out that he was living in the RV because he was putting his kids before himself so that his son could have his own room, something his ex never did despite being his mother. She just used the kids and the pregnancy as weapons to avoid working and emotionally blackmail everyone. Then he asked her to remind him how that was working out for her. I should mention this was early in their divorce. I'm sure everyone can guess her reaction. Dan said his ex threw quite a tantrum about my recent posts, but no one has bothered to contact me on her behalf to have me remove them. So she'll just have to live with the well-deserved shame. Lately, she's been trying to act nicer to Dan. I guess the grass isn't so green living with her parents. Dan tolerates her as the mother of his kids when they cross paths, but nothing more. He'll never take her back. He's told me he can never look at her the way he used to, and the very idea of her turns him off emotionally. So, my sister-in-law has basically no chance of reconciliation. I don't have any new information about my sister-in-law's affair partner. His social media is still blocked, just like hers, and they'll probably stay that way as long as I have the opportunity to read them. Update 9. It happened in the middle of the night, around the 1st of the month. I suspect it was my sister-in-law, but the person caught by my cameras was wearing heavy sweatshirts and had their face covered with large glasses that hid their eyes. It was impossible to tell if it was a man or a woman. They walked to my truck so no car could be identified. However, they seemed to have the height of my sister-in-law, but that's not much evidence on its own. If it was my sister-in-law, she knew about my cameras. So, covering her face and body for a petty act of revenge was probably the smartest thing she's done in years. A great way to finally put her university degree to use by throwing eggs at an old truck. This attacker appeared around 3 a.m. I was deeply asleep and didn't hear anything. The person that night quickly threw a dozen eggs or so all over my truck. At least they didn't try to do more damage and left in an instant. I didn't see the mess until I went out to work in the morning. I washed my truck at a local car wash during my lunch hour, which got most of the eggs off. I had to scrub it a little more later after work. The eggs aren't good for the paint, but the truck is from the 90s and doesn't exactly look new anyway. I took photos and filed a police report with the camera footage as evidence, but so far nothing has come of it. There was no real damage, other than my frustration and the money I spent at the car wash. If my sister-in-law did this, she was smart enough to only throw eggs and not scratch the paint or cut the tires, so my insurance wouldn't get involved. I don't think much will come from the police report since they seem to dismiss it as a likely prank by a teenager. I understand they're probably overloaded with work, but at least the report will leave a trace in case of future incidents. I waited to post until now because I wondered if anything else would happen, but nothing did. Just back to peace and quiet. I'd appreciate any good advice on the matter in case something like this happens again.